Andrei Soldatov is an investigative journalist and co-founder and editor of Agentura.ru, a watchdog of the Russian Secret Service's activities. He's been covering security services and terrorism issues since 1999. In addition to his contributions to Segodnia, Kampania, and I'm going to pronounce all of those with a Polish way, right? Novaya Gazeta, Echo Moskwy, Moscow News, Moscow Times, BBC, and Foreign Affairs, and many other news agencies, both radio and print media. So in addition to all of these, he's co-authored with Irina Borogan 3 very important books: New Patriot Games, How Secret Services Have Been Changing Their Skin, 1991 and 2004. Then The New Nobility, The Restoration of Russia's Security State and the Enduring Legacy of the KGB. And last but not least, The Red Web, The Struggle Between Russia's Digital Dictators and the New Online Revolutionaries. And all of these books were translated in multiple languages, which makes him really a key interlocutor in current Russian affairs, and how also Russian domestic affairs are involved in global politics. So today he's going to be talking about how the Kremlin, which was once fearful of the power of the internet and slightly behind the curve in terms of understanding the nature of the global network, found a way to use it in the US, the birthplace of the internet. So he's going to be talking about this briefly. We're going to have a long discussion after this. He prepared shorter remarks precisely because he wanted to have direct contact with the public. So please don't be shy and ask a question. And I just wanted to know that the Red Web, that book, the updated edition of the Red Web, which recently appeared, I think just this summer, has a completely new chapter about the US election and Russian interference in 2016. And a couple of weeks ago, Hillary Clinton was on campus also, and was talking about how she was writing her own memoir just when a lot of these news were just coming out and as investigations. So we're really eager to hear what you have to say. So please join me in welcoming Andrei Soldatov.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. As you have said, I'm an investigative journalist. I'm based in Moscow. I've been writing about the Russian security services and intelligence agencies since 1999 for many Russian publications. And yes, with Michael Farr, we got 2 books which were published initially in the United States for obvious reasons that already in the late 2000s it became really difficult to get your stories published in Russia, especially if we are talking about books. And the topic of the Red Web was inspired partly by 2 things. First is that by the late 2000s, the Kremlin became worried about the new economic crisis, and they believed it was about 2009, 2010 that they needed to do more to fight would-be troublemakers, people who might pose some problems. And they wanted to implement a very efficient system of control under pretext of fighting with extremism. And they wanted to identify in advance who might pose some problems, and that's why they needed to control the internet. The second reason why we understood that we need to pay more attention to what's going on the Russian internet was what actually happened in 2011-2012. In Moscow, we got the Moscow protests. And these protests were largely organized thanks to Facebook and Twitter. And given the fact that the Kremlin was already scared by the Arab Spring we wanted to do something about internet freedoms in my country. So, and it was a very crucial shift. For almost 20 years, I would say for 22 years, the Russian internet developed absolutely free of any government control. From 1991 to 2012, we had almost no legislation, no restrictions for the internet. And we got this only in 2012 as a direct aftermath of the Moscow protests. And we got internet filtering system, we got a very updated system of online surveillance. We got some people sent to jail for posting something critical of the authorities. But, so that was the theme of our book. We tried to understand how effective these efforts are. And we understood that actually, and the book was published in 2015, that the Kremlin largely failed on many levels. On technical level, the Russian system of internet filtering remains porous. Yes, we have a very huge blacklist of banned websites in Russia. It's huge. And we have some websites banned and blocked just by mistake because we have a very primitive system of blocking. For instance, you can block a website in Russia by IP address, which means, which is actually very stupid because one IP address might host thousands of websites. So you can block one website, one IP, but actually you block thousands of them. That's why now we have more than 1 million websites blocked in Russia, most of them by mistake. But still, if you want to get access to some blocked websites, political or any kind of website, you can easily find your way. You can use very primitive things. You do not need to use VPNs even. You can use Google Translate, and that would be enough. The other problem is that on the level of, say, what the people think of the Russian internet censorship, the Kremlin also was not very successful. They made some stupid mistakes, and specifically in 2015. And in the winter of, in the fall of 2015, they decided to block one of the biggest Russian video sharing websites. And then they decided to block Pornhub. That was really stupid. Immediately, Russia skyrocketed to the position number 2 in the number of users of Tor network. And Tor is the most popular system of circumventing censorship and surveillance. So you have people who immediately understood that now to use circumvention tools is essential. Maybe not because of political reasons. Well, Pornhub is not about political reasons, but still they understood that we need to use this. And the government didn't have any means, I mean technical or political, to put everybody under control. So that was the main conclusion of our book when it was published in 2015. But of course, since then, there have been some developments. Notably, in 2016, during the US election here in the United States. And we have the Russian interference. So we were asked by our publisher here to add a new chapter, to think and to write what we could add to the picture of the Russian meddling. And as journalists based in Moscow, we understood that there are some gaps, some problems in the narrative you had in 2016 about 2016. The biggest problem is that when you got this first news about, say, DNC hacking back in the summer of 2016, most of the news were provided by cybersecurity companies. And then this narrative was followed up by US intelligence reports, but essentially they were based on reports provided by cybersecurity companies like CrowdStrike or FireEye or some others. And the problem with this narrative is these reports are all based on digital forensic. They looked into what kind of malware we used, what kind of traces were left by Russian hackers. And it's very good. It's a very essential part of the investigation, but it's not enough. Why? Because digital forensic have some limits. One of them is you can use digital forensic now to identify the country. Now it's almost impossible to try to fool investigators saying like you use some service in India and you can pretend you are from India. Well, it doesn't work anymore. I mean, it maybe worked in 2009, 2011, but not now, not in 2016 and 2017. You also can use digital forensic to identify and to understand whether it was a state-backed effort, which is important, a very important part of the investigation. So now you cannot anymore pretend that it's about some hackers, some criminal groups not supported by the government. It's all about their patriotic activity. But you cannot get further. You cannot identify who actually was behind this attack. You cannot say, for example, what kind of agency was behind this attack. And of course, you cannot answer a very crucial question is why? Why actually you got this attack? And that was our goal. In our new chapter, which we added this summer, we tried to answer some questions which were important, very important for us, reporting from Moscow. So the first question was why? Whether we have, the question is that sometimes we think it was a strategy all along, from the very beginning, from 2015, to try to hack the elections, to support Trump, to weaken Hillary Clinton. And to be honest, what we found out is that we have several phases in this operation, in a very complicated operation. And the first phase, which lasted from the summer of 2015 until April of 2016, looked like a gathering of intelligence by hackers. And they did that very quietly. They were not detected. And to me, it looks like it was a kind of conventional espionage operation. You have some people in the system of DNC quietly collecting something, some information they can have access to. And what happened next? We have this strange event. Something happened around April, which prompted the Kremlin to think that now it's time to weaponize this information, to make it public. So we try to understand why. And I think we identified the reason. And the reason was that in April, lots of journalists, they had actually joined their forces and investigating a big trove of documents from Panama, which now known as Panama Papers. And one of the biggest exposés in this big investigation was information about Sergei Raldugin, a cellist who happens to be a personal friend of Vladimir Putin. So this information, this big investigation was published in the beginning of April. And the problem was that by that time, the second group of Russian hackers were already in the system of DNC, and they already had access to Podesta emails. And probably you remember that one of the biggest things about Podesta emails was about paid speech made by, speeches actually, made by Hillary Clinton at Goldman Sachs. So what we found out is that Putin apparently was already briefed about this information found in Podesta emails by the moment when he got this big news about Panama Papers. And it looks like there was a strange miscalculation. He was apparently briefed that this investigation of journalists was not a real investigation, but it was a conspiracy, it was a plot against him with Goldman Sachs, Hillary Clinton, and some journalists involved. And given the fact that by that moment, he already believed that Hillary Clinton was a kind of Russia hater, and she was seen in Russia as someone who actually had inspired and supported the Moscow protest in 2011, 2012. So for him and for some of his friends in the Kremlin, the picture was very clear. You have Hillary Clinton, she had attacked us during our elections, and now she tried to do something again against us. And now she crossed the line trying to attack my personal friends. So it looks very justifiable for people in the Kremlin to try to fight back. So our next question we wanted to answer was to identify the precise moment when the decision was made. And we believe that we identified at least one meeting, and this meeting took place on April 8th. And it was a meeting of the Russian Security Council, and 8 people were present, 6 of them with some experience and background in the KGB. And the official theme of the meeting was to discuss something very normal, something about military pensions. But some sources told us that actually the theme of this meeting was to talk how to fight back. And 2 weeks later, the domain name dcleaks.com was registered. So we believe that was a moment when the Kremlin decided to weaponize information. The next question we wanted to answer is to understand who were behind this operation. And the problem here is that Russia is not China. With China, if you have some cyber attacks from China, well, of course it's very difficult to identify all players there, but at least you can think that it's because China is so hierarchical. You have some units in charge of cyber warfare, and that helps you to identify who were behind this particular operation. In Russia, it's much more complicated. Yes, we have cybersecurity agencies. We have security agencies, we have intelligence agencies very active in cyber. But at the same time, we have tactics developed by the Kremlin for, I would say, 15, 16 years. And these tactics is their outsourcing. They got to these tactics because of many reasons, but primarily because when they started back in 1999 and 2001, the biggest problem for the Kremlin online was activities of Chechen websites. They wanted to take them down, and they didn't have methods. And then, just by chance, a group of students in Tomsk, in Siberia, they volunteered. They attacked the website and took it down. And the local branch of the Russian security services was so fascinated by this new opportunity, so they immediately praised this effort. And that was the moment the Kremlin understood. Look, we can use some people, and then we can deny our responsibility. And of course, many years passed after 2001, and these tactics has been updated. So now it's not about some students. It's about groups which are not directly affiliated by the government, but they are encouraged and directed by the government. What makes things much more difficult for investigators is that these people are not, in many cases, working for the security services. Sometimes they do, but in many cases they are directed from the very top, from the administration of the president. And that means that for you, it's, and I mean for journalists, it's extremely difficult to identify and to prove that there is a direct line between the Russian, say, bureaucracy, the Russian government, and hackers. And when we got the very first attack abroad, I mean, in 2007, Russian hackers attacked Estonia, that became a big challenge. The Estonian government initially said, look, we know it's the Kremlin. But 2 days later, they were forced to withdraw this accusation precisely because they didn't find the proof to connect the hackers with the Kremlin. And that provoked the Kremlin to think that you can use these tactics and you can always deny your responsibility. And that's actually what the Kremlin did after 2016. When the Kremlin spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, was asked in June about all these accusations and about a report made by CrowdStrike. He said, "We completely rule out that any Russian government organization was behind this attack." And for people in Moscow, it was a direct sign. It was a wink, like, it's not about government organizations, it's about someone else. And Putin supported the same line. When he was asked recently about this attack, once again he said, look, we completely rule out that Russian governments could be behind this, but we cannot rule out that some Russian hackers sitting somewhere could be behind this attack. So it proved to be very, very effective. And it's still a big problem. And finally, what we wanted to answer and what we wanted to describe is what actually happened in Russia after the election. Because we might think that it was a big success for Russia, we got Trump, and it's a big deal, but to be honest, nobody expected Trump to win in Moscow. Everybody believed that, and given the fact that these guys in the Kremlin, I mean the security services, they have this conspiratorial mindset, they actually believed that all things about the US election were already predetermined. Like the American establishment already decided that Hillary Clinton would be the next president. So what we wanted to do, we just wanted to weaken her, to make her look more vulnerable, and then probably with her in the White House to try to do something with the anti-Russian sanctions. And surprisingly, we got Trump elected. That was completely unexpected. Yes, we got some celebrations in Moscow, some jubilation, we got some champagne, and the Russian parliament, parties were given. It was absolutely crazy. You can see cars driving with American flags, like now we are finally, we did something. But lots of people in the Kremlin and in the Russian security services became extremely worried. They understood that there is no way to get out of this situation without any consequences. That there is already some investigation in the United States, and we need to do something about it. So what happened next in Russia is we got some big operation with the intention to cover the tracks. And we got some people sent to jail, and we got some people dismissed. And the most interesting thing that if you look at actually what happened, you can see that the agency which suffered most after the election in Russia was the Russian security service. Two guys ended up on FBI most wanted list. Two guys were sent to jail in Moscow. One guy who was in charge of cybersecurity, and he's an FSB general, and he was deputy head of the Russian Security Council, so which is the highest position. So he was the most prominent Russian cybersecurity official. He was dismissed in January. So we got lots of purges inside of the FSB. We got some problems on the level of foreign ministry, which means that people now in Moscow are extremely nervous. And for them, it's a big question, actually, with U.S. investigation and what it could bring to, what it could actually, what kind of names could be highlighted and announced. That's what we got. It's a developing story, of course, and we are getting some news every week. For example, we didn't expect, when we wrote our chapter, that Russian ads on Facebook or Twitter were such a big deal. It looks like now it's much more, it looks much more important than we expected. So let's see. As I said, it's a developing story, which is a fascinating thing for journalists, because you can follow these things and you can hope that, someday you can get the whole story. Probably it would happen, so I'm a bit optimistic, but still we need some time. So thank you.
We have plenty of time for questions. Liz, should we pass around the microphone if it's being taped?
Yes, we should just start. Yeah. We have two. We can each be on one side of the room. So.
Yeah. So don't be shy. Here's your chance to ask anything
No
you
questions.
want.
Everything is clear. Well.
Can you, recently Kaspersky Labs was discovered, or I believe the US State Department recommended, or required rather, that Kaspersky Labs software be removed from all of their computers because of potential malware. I actually can't remember if they found malware, if it was just concerned that there was malware.
No,
Can you comment on that?
Yeah. Actually, it's a very good question because it's not only about Kaspersky. We have a very vibrant, very successful cybersecurity community in Russia, and Kaspersky is just one of his companies. The problem is that it gets me back to this problem of outsourcing. Because it's a long story. It's about 17 years. So for the first 15 years, I would say from 2001 to 2014, when they thought of, say, cooperation between the private sector, some informal actors, and the Kremlin, doing something nasty online, it was mostly about some criminal groups, some criminal hackers caught by the FSB or just, invited to help the FSB or some other security agencies to do something for the Kremlin in other countries. But that completely changed after 2014. After the annexation of Crimea, Putin personally made this very strong statement, and he sent this signal to everybody that now it's time, because we are under attack, I'm in Russia, so that's time for the businesses to help the state. And he also decided to send this message specifically to the IT industry. He had a meeting with the biggest Russian IT entrepreneurs in June of 2014, and his main message was, you cannot hide from us. And to be honest, this message was repeated on many levels, and after that we understood and we got some proofs and some stories were exposed that the government officials started approaching Russian cybersecurity companies, asking them to do something sensitive. And we got at least one example, very well documented and actually reported first by the Russian media and then by the New York Times, but the Russian companies which provided DDoS protection. DDoS means denial of service attack. For Russian companies and for Russian media, and this company actually was quite liberal. They had helped some Russian media back in 2011, 2012. But in 2015, this company was approached by some officials from the Russian Ministry of Communications and some other guys, and asked to lend them a guy and to send this guy to Sofia in Bulgaria and to help the state. This guy was sent to Sofia, and when he entered the room, he understood that actually he was asked to help to build a DDoS weapon. So he spent his career trying to protect websites against DDoS attacks, and now he was asked by the government to help him to use DDoS. And actually he saw a DDoS software, very powerful, and in his presence, they tested this software on the website of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, and also on some independent media in Russia. This guy got scared and he left the country, and he provided all this information to journalists. That's why we know this story. But it's just one of examples when we have a cybersecurity company with a very good reputation approached by the government. And in the new climate we got in Moscow after the annexation of Crimea, in no position to say no. My problem with Kaspersky is Kaspersky personally, he developed and cultivated his contacts with the Russian security services for many years. And actually he believed for many years that it's a good thing to be close to the FSB. He was himself trained in the KGB Institute. He didn't see it as a problem. And he also believed that it could help him not only in Russia, but outside Russia. And to be honest, for many years it was fine. the FSB, as a Russian Federal Security Agency, enjoyed quite a good reputation right until 2016. Why? Because of counterterrorism cooperation. Probably you remember this awful terrorist attack in Boston, Boston bombings. And probably you remember that just before Boston bombings, the FSB sent some letters to FBI and CIA about would-be bombers. So this information was reported in the United States as a story how the FSB tried to warn CIA and FBI about the upcoming attack. And that's why the FSB was invited to many meetings in DC, even after the annexation of Crimea, when many Russian agencies were sanctioned. For instance, in April of 2015, the chief of the FSB was invited to DC to a counterterrorism conference, and the chief of FBI was not invited. So these guys actually enjoyed quite a good reputation. So Kaspersky believed, apparently, that it's fine to be seen close to these guys, to help them sometimes. And to my opinion, he went too far into cooperation. I mean, in this cooperation with the FSB. Sometimes he provided just an expertise. But in many cases, Kaspersky actually, and his company actually joined forces with the FSB in conducting some operations. The Kaspersky line of defense was always to say and to pretend that the FSB is nothing more but a law enforcement agency, just like FBI. And of course, it's just not true. FSB is not only a law enforcement agency, it's also an intelligence agency. And of course, if they see the opportunity to collect something, some information which might be worthy of it, so they use these opportunities. So it looks like Kaspersky opened some doors in his company for these guys, thinking that it will be fine for years. And now he caught in this game and he doesn't know how to get out. And that's the biggest problem. He just suddenly understood that to be seen close to the FSB is a very strange thing actually it's compromised the whole thing for him. And also he and his people were extremely, I would say, adventurous and doing things in cooperation with the FSB. So to be honest, at the same time, I feel very sorry for him because he's not a Russian oligarch. He built his business from scratch. And I mean, he was not helped by the state. And he is a very smart guy, and his company is very, very efficient, and they're very smart, and they're just good. And they did some good things. But right now, while maybe he paid for his ideas that to be close to the security services is a good thing.
I have a question. We talked about this a little bit earlier before the event, but I wonder if you could comment on how you actually conduct your work and how easy or difficult it is to speak with sources and what kind of, I assume it's dangerous for them to reveal certain things to you and why do they speak to you and how, and do you feel like you're in a spy movie yourself? Or, I mean, can you talk a little bit about the craft and the business of being a journalist in what is an authoritarian regime in some way?
Well, in a way, what helps is what we started doing these things many years ago, which means that, back then it was much more, to be honest, easier. Because people, inside of the security services, were willing to talk to you, and you always have some unhappy people in any security agencies. You have unhappy people here, we have our unhappy people. They might be unhappy for different reasons, like your whistleblowers are usually unhappy because of some political reasons, like Snowden or Chelsea Manning. Russian whistleblowers are people or sources who want to talk to journalists. They're usually unhappy because of some very materialistic reasons, like they're unhappy about their superiors, they're unhappy about their pensions, about their apartments. So the biggest challenge for journalists when you meet such a person is that you need sometimes literally spend days with these people talking about something extremely boring, something about their apartments, and why they think that they need to get, I don't know, they deserve 3 rooms apartment, not 2 rooms apartment. But finally, you have your chance to ask some good questions. And we got some of our sources back in 1999, 2000, 2003, and these people trust us. It's one thing. The second thing is when you live in a country where everybody has this conspiratorial mind, and they believe that every kind of activity should be sanctioned by someone, sometimes it's help. For instance, I had this bit strange story with an FSB general. So for the book, I wanted to understand and to find a guy who actually invented the idea of surveillance online for Russia. I tried many things. Finally, in some documents, I found the name. And the name was Bykov. And I thought, okay, fine, where I can find this guy? His signature was actually on many documents in the 1990s, and so I thought, that's my guy. Now he's retired, and finally I found him in a telecommunication company, on the board of a telecommunication company. And of course I understood it's absolutely helpless to send him requests, but I tried to play with, an American journalist. I sent the request, I need to do that. So I sent a request by email and with my phone number. And 10 minutes later, I got a call from this guy. I never got a call from an FSB general, to be honest, before that. And I was really surprised. And he said, well, you were looking for me. I said, yes, Anatoly Borisovich, I wanted to talk to you about SORM. And SORM is a Russian system of online surveillance, means a system of operative search measures. And he said, okay, fine. And I said, well, can we meet tomorrow? He said, yes, fine. 10 o'clock on Lubyanka Square. Okay, fine. So next day, actually, I met him. He was there. And for 2 hours, he was talking about these things. He told me the whole story. And I was really surprised because he looked very uneasy. For example, I brought with me a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, because I didn't know what he wanted, and he refused. He said, no, I don't want to. And I found myself with 2 caps, just actually circling around and this square. And when I said, maybe we can sit, he said, no, we need to walk. So why to meet me? And finally, when we were about to part, he said, Andrei, but I understand you were sent by the press office of the FSB? I said, no. So he thought, but because I found his name and I found his email, that should mean that I am sent by the press office of the FSB. So in this way, he thought I was sanctioned by the FSB, and only after 2 hours of talk, he understood I'm not, probably I was not sanctioned. And he decided to ask me, and I said no, and I saw a terror in his eyes, like just, who is this guy? And immediately he said, look, it's all off the record, blah, blah, blah. I said, well, no, it doesn't work this way. You already told me this story. Unfortunately, well, I need to put it in my book. And he said, okay, fine. So sometimes it might be really crazy. And this climate could help you. And when you have this country with lots of people, I mean, it's also, it's very conspiratorial. Everybody thinks that if someone published something, it should be sanctioned by someone. So sometimes people might meet me and try to send some message. Like I had a guy who is my friend for, I don't know, 20 years. And he just recently I had a meeting with him, and he told me, look, Andrei, now you need to say this to your liberal generals of the FSB. Why these liberal generals of the FSB? I don't know them. I just don't understand. But in his mind, it means that he believes that if I'm writing something about these things, I'm not in prison. So it means that I'm protected by some very powerful people, and now he could send a message to them, which is not true.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, I just wanted to say thank you very much for coming out here and doing this talk today. It takes a lot to talk about this stuff, so we appreciate it.
Thank you.
The question that I have is that I wonder, I'm a little sort of confused as to exactly why Putin would go out of his way to sort of, consolidate power right around the idea, or around the idea that Clinton might be, anti-Putin or anti-Russia. And I was wondering, in your work, if you found any reasons sort of for him to have that idea, or if you found any policies in specific that Clinton might propose that would be anti-Russian, or I guess sort of what I'm asking is why exactly would Putin think that Clinton is pitted against him, I guess?
Well, for two reasons. The first one is that during the Moscow protest, Hillary Clinton was state secretary, and she had some very smart people in charge of, say, internet policy. And one of them was Alec Ross. And just after the Arab Spring, Alec Ross was in London giving a talk. And he said something about that these days we praise all these revolutions, and also we should say that the internet is a new Che Guevara. Well, the problem is if you already have this paranoid mentality in the Kremlin, like everybody try to find a way how to undermine your political stability. Well, this statement was taken with horror in the Kremlin. Everybody noticed it, and everybody believed that this was a proof that actually social media were invented by the State Department as a way to undermine political stability. And the problem is that the Kremlin believed for years that the Kremlin is in a kind of arms race with the State Department for years. It started back in the beginning of 2000s. The thing is that if you have an authoritarian society, your usual ways to mobilize people, to prompt them to go to streets to protest, say, trade unions and opposition parties, political parties. In Russia, these things were put under control many years ago, I would say by the late 1990s. So you cannot use them to ask people to go to streets. So for the Kremlin, when we got these color revolutions, probably you know what it is. A wave of revolutions first in Serbia, then in Ukraine, in Kyrgyzstan, some other countries. These protests, these revolutions were organized with completely new organizations. They didn't use opposition parties, they didn't use trade unions, they used youth movements, which were built from scratch very quickly. So for the Kremlin, this idea to use youth movements to mobilize people was seen as a kind of as a new toolkit of the State Department. They found a way how to deal with it. They launched their own pro-Kremlin youth movements to have someone to send them to streets in case of a protest. And then they anxiously waited for the next step. And when we got this Arab Spring, and when Alec Ross said something about Che Guevara, people in the FSB, in the Kremlin, they decided that this is the next step. Now they found a way how to mobilize people, not only without opposition parties and trade unions, but even without youth movement. You can have technology to organize people. You do not have any kind of organization. And this is a very scary moment for any security services, because they have this idea how to deal with any kind of crisis. And in Russia, as I was told by the FSB people, it's always about three things. So if you have any kind of crisis, any kind of situation, you look for an organization, for a leader, and for a channel to get a funding from outside. If you can identify these three things, you can deal with the problem and you can solve this problem. But with the Arab Spring, you have no organization, you have no leader. In many cases, there was no leader, and you have no channel for funding outside because there was none. And that was also true for the Moscow protest. So for many people in the Kremlin and for Putin personally, Hillary Clinton was someone who invented this strategy, which was seen as a very effective thing. That actually explains why people in the Kremlin got so scared about the Moscow protest. Because actually it was not such a big thing. On the height of the protest in December of 2011, the biggest Russian rally was about 100,000 people. Just 100,000 people. In Moscow, we have more than 14 million people living. So it's not a big deal. But the Kremlin got scared because they put this in the context of this big battle with the State Department. That's why Putin was so personally pissed off by Hillary Clinton. It's also very personal because he doesn't like women in politics, and it's not only about Hillary Clinton, but it's also about Angela Merkel. He's a very masculine guy, so for him it was always very personal. And because Panama Papers investigation was about his personal friend, it became double personal for him. In Russia, if you live in Moscow and you're a journalist, you know that there is one line it's very risky to cross. You cannot attack his personal friends. You cannot write about his about his family. It's very risky. And that's exactly what happened. His personal friend was exposed. And because he believed that Goldman Sachs was behind this thing and Goldman Sachs provided some funding to Hillary Clinton, it's a kind of very strange conspiracy, but actually he decided that he found some proof in these emails of Podesta. For him, it's built a picture. That's why.
Hi. Given what you said about this kind of conspiratorial mindset, the hands-off relationship between government leaders and the hacker groups seems very surprising to me. Wouldn't they be very worried that the hacker groups will attack someone or do something that they don't care for? They'd probably have fairly limited control over them if they also have this kind of deniability.
Well, the problem is that we need to remember a thing about Russian technical education, because most of these hackers, they are not from nowhere. They are children of the Russian technical intelligentsia, of Russian engineer community, and many of them, they got very good training in Russian technical schools and universities. And the problem with the Russian technical education is it's very specific. It's very different from what you have here. We got maybe the largest engineer community in the world by the late 80s in the Soviet Union only because of the military-industrial complex. Stalin built this and launched all these polytechnical and technical schools to serve the military-industrial complex and the KGB. And he wanted to train these guys in a very specific way. He wanted to give them only technical skills, but not a proper university education, which means very specific things. For example, Russian engineers are still not trained in ethics. They are not told what might happen with AI technologies. And it's a big deal, actually, because these guys are not trained to ask and to question big picture. And by definition, they understand secrecy. In many Russian technical universities, if you apply, the second year, you need to sign a security clearance. And it makes you very well understandable of these things. But these guys are extremely close to the military-industrial complex ideologically because the military-industrial complex provides jobs and social standing. So when we got the military-industrial complex collapsed in the 1990s, it's angered a lot of people and made them even more patriotic because we started blaming the West. And the very first Russian generation of hackers, they were children of these engineers. They were pissed off. They understood who was the enemy. It was about the West. And they just needed some allies. And the Russian security services and the Kremlin just helped them to channel this feeling of anger and grievance against particular targets. But it also means that these guys feel that they are absolutely, I would say, vulnerable for the Russian security services inside of Russia. And that's why for some years these hackers, they didn't want to work for the Kremlin directly. Actually, there was a guy who tried to invite some FSB people into the closed hacker community, and he got immediately expelled. Because hackers were very afraid of this direct connection between them and the FSB. But after 2014, the signal was sent that now we need to change the rules. You need to work directly. And the proof is this great investigation conducted by FBI about the Yahoo hacking in 2014. That's the very first example when we have FSB people working directly with criminal hackers. And to be honest, these guys are still very afraid. They feel very vulnerable, and they are not, in many cases, they are not ready to talk. So let's see what happened, because now we got some people arrested in Spain, in Prague, in Canada. So maybe we finally we can get some new information about this relationship, but it's only the beginning.
Hi. So I have a question about Russia's astroturfing and troll efforts. And my question is about this kind of seeming contradiction where you have this decentralized system where you have outsourcing to these loosely affiliated groups of engineers, but you also have this really sophisticated technique. You look at some of the ads that were on Facebook, and they look like straight out of psychology or political science experiments, where you're trying to like trigger people's ideological or identity beliefs. So I'm wondering if you have an explanation for how they came up with these messages and how they tested and piloted them.
Well, the thing is that we are decentralized. It doesn't mean that we are very far from the Kremlin. Actually, it means the opposite. These guys are actually, they have more direct access to the Kremlin than, say, people in the security services. Russian security services are bureaucracy, which means in Russia, a very inefficient bureaucracy. You need to have lots of sanctions, a lot of approval from all your superiors. For trolls factories, for people working directly for the Kremlin, they have this direct access, which means that they can easily ask what we can do next, and they can get funding, and that makes them much more adventurous and much more flexible and much more efficient than, say, the Russian bureaucracy. That's why inside of the country we actually failed, but outside, I mean, the Kremlin's efforts to control the internet. Because inside Russia, it was mostly done by bureaucracy. Outside, it's all by these groups affiliated with the Kremlin's administration. And it also means that if you want to do something adventurous, you do not need to go to the FSB. You need to go higher. And that means that you might recruit the bravest and the brightest people, and you can get some support from other departments. And in Russia, bureaucracy doesn't work horizontally. Say, if you want to run a joint operation between two security services, it's not enough to try to connect them. It's not like here. You need to have someone on the very top, on the Kremlin, to say to these guys, look, now you need to work together. So in all cases, if you need to run a very effective operation, you need to go to the Kremlin and ask them to help you to ask as other agencies, from, say, propaganda agencies to PR companies, to help you to run your operation. And because these guys are placed in a very good position, because are really close to the Kremlin, that makes them much more, I would say, effective than other agencies. That explains this efficiency, effectiveness.
Maybe we'll get 2 or 3 questions.
Thank you.
Yes, it's up to you. You want to collect the questions?
Let's collect, because we have 5 minutes left, and I saw who else? You.
And yeah, it's.
Yes. So brief questions, and then you'll.
Okay.
Conclude.
Okay.
Thank you. In the first part of your talk, you talked about this picture when the government is trying to control the internet, like to not let it develop in an undesired direction, right? Can you say a few words about this other half of the picture, which is like using the internet for, say, propaganda, for developing like types of mobilizing the patriotic and elitist, and I would say for the latest years of Putin regime, conservative types of discussions and ideas and so on and so forth. And this very small second question that is connected to the first one is whether or not do you see, is there an alternative explanations to this, anti-Clinton actions of Russian hackers, which would somehow connect with some pragmatic results in internal politics in Russia? Like they would show that, say, American voters do vote for a president that is more pro-Russian than the other one, and they will somehow help develop the withheld state propaganda in Russia. So, like, is there some alternative, more pragmatic explanations for this kind of actions, or is this just all about Putin's insult or his personal reasons? Thank you. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Very brief question.
So I know you talked about so how most of the hysteria was because it was pro-Clinton as opposed to, or I mean anti-Clinton as opposed to pro-Trump. But how do you feel that it's affected? Was there any type of hope for Putin to cooperate with Trump, like with when Trump fired on the Syrian airfield? I know that didn't have to do with the Red Web or anything, but do you feel as though Putin is disappointed, or he didn't really have any hope for Trump? It was just more anti-Clinton.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So during your investigation, did you find any evidence that suggested that the Kremlin kind of took into consideration what kind of impact that this would have on the Russian public? So strategically thinking, like, did this
here,
support?
You mean the Russian community here in the United States? Or
No, in Russia. So
in Russia. Oh, okay.
Yeah. So how did this affect perceptions of the Kremlin?
And there's one last. Sorry, you asked me already. So, the guy with the plaid shirt. Very briefly, because we have like 3 minutes.
I was just wondering, based upon your findings, how confident you are that the goal of this campaign was to weaken Hillary Clinton rather than elect Donald Trump, or if maybe the goal wasn't thoroughly defined throughout the process.
Okay, good. So let me start with how the Kremlin, how successful Kremlin was using the internet. To be honest, I would say that before 2014, before Ukraine, it was not very successful for technical reasons. Like, for example, we had trolls in Russia active since 2006, but it was mostly about live journal where the anonymous postings and comments are allowed. But during the protests, well, most of Russian Moscow liberals, they moved to Facebook. So actually for 2 years, trolls, they didn't know what to do. They didn't find any way to influence the debate during the protest, so they failed. And I would say they finally found a way how to do things on Facebook only after the annexation of Crimea because of Ukraine. And on Facebook they started sending complaints, attacking prominent Russian liberals. Like if Facebook administration gets, say, thousands of complaints saying like this guy posted lots of child pornography, they take down a website. You can try to challenge this decision, but it's time costly. And still on some pages of Russian liberals, you can see this line that this page was blocked 6 times or 7 times. It's because of trolls. But I would say that, to be honest, inside the country, it was not very effective because the information was still available. If you want to, you still can get access to information about the Russian military presence in Ukraine. It's not blocked. You can find a way. And even in terms of propaganda, inside Russia, this propaganda was not that successful because actually, and I think it was consciously done because people wanted to hear something which would support their point of view. Like, for example, when we got this crisis with MH17, the downing of a plane in Ukraine, the Russian propaganda said that it was CIA conspiracy, and people just wanted to believe this theory. So the Russian propaganda didn't create a new narrative. It was they just feel the expectations. Inside Russia. Pragmatic explanation. There was a pragmatic explanation. They wanted to compromise the election process. What we wanted to say, you always accuse us of that we rig our elections. Actually, you have your election rigged, and that actually is the biggest proof that nobody expected in Moscow Trump to win, because the day of the elections there was some tweets already ready to be posted with some message like "this election is rigged." And some of them were actually posted by mistake because nobody actually believed initially that Trump won. So that was the idea. what was, did they think about the Russian population? To be honest, I would say that they started thinking about it maybe only in the summer of 2016, and it looks like initially the message for the Russian public was, like, it's always good to say that Americans are stupid, they blame us of everything, but at the same time it was a good thing, because you can always say, look, finally Russia is so great, so powerful, they get everybody talking about Russia. Maybe in a bad way, but still it means how important they are. And that means a lot for the post-Soviet confused society, because people wanted to have some bigger role in the world, and Putin actually delivered. He gives them some place on the world stage. And finally, about what they think about Trump now. It looks like people are actually very confused. I mean, I know that everybody gets confused, but some people in the foreign ministry, they already say privately that, well, with Hillary Clinton it would be much more predictable. And this is one thing. The next thing is, as I already said, the organizations which most suffered thanks to the election, I mean in Russia, was the FSB. But the second one is the foreign ministry. Because some of the facilities were closed down, some people were expelled. We got 2 Russian ambassadors in the United States, I mean to UN and to the United States, replaced. One of them died for some mysterious reason. It means a lot. It means that you have institutions in charge of defining the Russian foreign policy under enormous pressure. The foreign ministry now is not in position to say anything about sensitive things like Syria or Ukraine. You need to talk to completely different kind of guys. Unfortunately, it doesn't mean, well, anything good. Why? Because when you see this decline of institutions, when you see that bureaucracies which are in charge of dealing with some sensitive issues, they are in decline, they are not anymore in charge of these things. You have small bunch of people at the level of the administration of the president in charge of everything. And because they do not take responsibility for their actions, because they're supposedly not in charge of it, that makes them much more adventurous. So what we got now, as an aftermath of the election, we got decline of Russian institutions in charge of foreign policy and security policy, but at the same time, the Russian foreign policy itself is getting more adventurous.
Thank you very much for
thank you.
your work.